Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion with classical conditioning. This is lesson 4.2, and you are going to be able to identify the process of acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination in classical conditioning. And this is, again, all related to classical conditioning. So remember, classical conditioning is the association of two items together that causes learning, or two stimuluses together that cause learning. So pairing one thing with another repeatedly until you learn. So acquisition is the initial learning. So essentially we're taking a look at that very first. So initial, we're talking first learning. Oops. So once you first learn something. And this is important for classical conditioning when you're pairing two things together, because you need to think about how quickly do you need to pair or how quickly do you need to make the pairing for learning to occur, is the question. So can I pair two things together but have them be separated by 5 minutes? Would that still create learning? And the answer to that question is it varies, right? Acquisition varies. So pairing the two stimuluses together, we'll talk about some ways to do that to make it the most effective, but that varies. Now, another thing that you can do when it comes to classical conditioning is train for what we call higher order or second order conditioning. And really, what that means is that after the initial classical conditioning, so this is going to happen after the classical conditioning, you can teach a secondary response. Or learn, I guess I should say, learn a secondary response. So what does that mean? Well, let's say that I pair Bell with food. Bell plus food. Okay, and we do that repeatedly multiple times. Then let's say I add a light plus Bell plus food equals salivate. And what will eventually happen is the Bell will cause the individual to salivate, as will the light. And that is higher order or secondary conditioning, because you not just train them to respond to the bell, but the light as well. So how can you change your conditioned response? Will it last forever? And the answer is no. So once you gain acquisition, right here, right? Acquisition means that you've learned it. So once you've given that, if you all of a sudden stopped, right? If you all of a sudden, let's say, gave the conditioned stimulus, in this case, the bell, with no unconditioned stimulus, eventually you're going to have what we call extinction. And extinction happens when you stop responding. To the conditioned stimulus. Now, what's kind of fun with this though, or kind of neat with this though, is so you haven't had it paired for a really long time. And then you go through what we call a pause period, right? Where nothing happens, you're not responding, no big deal. And then all of a sudden, let's say it's been a couple days or a week or whatever it may be, you all of a sudden have a response again. And we call that spontaneous recovery. And spontaneous recovery is when the conditioned response comes back randomly after extinction has occurred. So not only when you're pairing two things together can you eventually stop that pairing or what we call unlearn the conditioned response. So you can do that. But in addition to the conditioned responses, you can also do what we call generalization or discrimination to the learning. So again, you're pairing two things together. Generalization, it sounds exactly what it is, right? That we respond to similar but different conditioned stimuluses. So let's say they're trying to get you to respond and they ring a bell, they play a key from the piano, or they, I don't know, play the flute, right? Those are three different noises. But if they're again involved with the pairing, then it is possible for them, for the person to generalize that sound means food or means whatever it may mean. But on the flip side of that, we can also discriminate, which means that we can tell the difference between similar but different conditioned stimuluses. Now, this can happen only after what we call overlearning, and we'll get to that when we get to that chapter. But overlearning means that you've learned it above and beyond. And lastly, we're going to talk about little Albert. Little Albert, they learned to do fear conditioning with. And again, same concept, right? You're pairing two stimuluses together until learned behavior occurs. In this case, this was done by John Watson. Did the study on baby Albert. And essentially what he did was he paired fluffy white animal, and at the time it was a rat, with a very loud noise. And he did this repeatedly until the baby was then afraid of anything white and fluffy. And so what happened eventually was that the baby learned to generalize or apply that this white thing or white furry fuzzy thing always means a very, very loud noise. And so what we've learned today, what we've covered today, is kind of the next steps after classical conditioning, right? So you did classical conditioning, acquisition, they've learned, but now what? Well, there's a couple things. One, you could do a higher order or secondary conditioning. You could add more to what they've already learned, what they've already conditioned. But you need to be aware that extinction does happen. So if you stopped reinforcing one of these behaviors, there's a strong possibility that they may not do those behaviors again. But in addition to that, yeah. And then moving on from there is the idea of extinction once you stop pairing two things together, and then eventually fear conditioning, where you pair something with a frightening noise or sound or smell. And that is it for today.